السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, ladies and
السيدات
gentlemen.
والسادة الحضور الكرام،
Ladies and gentlemen,
متابعين على مواقع التواصل
our
الاجتماعي،
followers on the social
أهلا وسهلا
media,
بكم.
thank you for
أنا
joining us and
اسمي
welcome to
غسان
my
الكحلوت،
name is
مدير
Ghassan
مركز
Elkahlout.
دراسات
I'm
النزاع
the
والعمل
director
الإنساني.
of the Center for
يطيب
Conflict
لي أن
Studies and
أرحب بالنيابة عن
Humanitarian Work.
المركز بضيفنا لهذا
I
اليوم
would like, on
السيد خالد
behalf
عمر
of our
يوسف،
center, to welcome
الذي
Mr.
سيأخذنا
Khalid
في هذا
Omer
اللقاء
Yousif,
للحديث عن
who
التحديات
will be
والفرص
talking
للانتقال
to us
الديمقراطي
about
في
the
السودان.
challenges and
سيتم بث
opportunities
الملتقى
of
مباشرة عبر وسائل
democratic
التواصل
change
الاجتماعي
in
للمركز
Sudan.
مع
This
توافر خاصية
event will
الترجمة
be
الفورية
live
إلى الإنجليزية،
streamed
ويمكن
and
للمتابعين عبر
be
الشبكات الاجتماعية
simultaneously
كتابة أسئلتهم
interpreted
في
into
التعليقات تحت
English.
البث
You
المباشر.
can
أما
write
الحضور
your
الكريم
comments and
فيمكنهم التفضل
questions through the
بتقديم
live
أسئلتهم
streaming,
لطرحها خلال الجلسة
and
المخصصة للمناقشة.
here in this room you can pose your questions directly.
كنت قد قمت بتحضير بعض
I
المعلومات
prepared some
لتقديم محاضرة
information to
عن السودان،
present
ولكن على
a
حديثي
lecture
مع
on the
السيد خالد
Sudan, but after my
وجدت انه
talk with
ان
Mr.
الوقت
Khalid,
يعني
I
بكامله للسيد
decided
خالد
that the
للحديث،
entire
لنعطي يعني وقتا اكثر
lecture should
له
be devoted
للشرح
to
ووقتا
him
اكثر للنقاش.
to
كل ما اريد ان اقدم السيد خالد
present his
عمر يوسف
presentation
وهو
and
وزير
allow some
شؤون
time
مجلس الوزراء
for
للحكومه
discussion.
الانتقاليه السابقه
He was
والقيادي في قوى
formerly
الحريه والتغيير
a
وعضو المكتب
Minister
السياسي
of
لحزب المؤتمر
State
السوداني،
in the
وذلك
transitional
وهو
government
سوف يقوم
and
بالحديث عن
a
التحديات
member
العديدة
of
التي
the
تواجه
Sudanese
الحكومة الانتقالية
Congress
السودانية
Party.
والمرتبطة
He will
بتداعياتها
be
والخلافات
talking about
المستمرة بين
the
أطرافها مع استمرار
opportunities
سوء
and
الأوضاع
challenges
الاقتصادية
of
والتدخلات
the
الخارجية في شؤون
transition
السودان
to
وصعوبة استدامة السلام في
democracy
المنطقة.
and the difficulties
بالإضافة إلى ذلك
in
سيناقش وفينا
establishing
اليوم
peace and
الفرص التي
security.
تتوفر لدى
He
الحكومة
will
التي
be
تقوم على الأعمال
discussing the
المتعلقة بالدعم الدولي
opportunities
والإقليمي من أجل شق
um,
الطريق نحو الديمقراطية في السودان.
available to the government
السيد
in
خالد
Sudan.
عمر يوسف
Mr.
حاصل على
Khalid
بكالوريوس
Omer
في الهندسة
Yusuf, he
المدنية من جامعة الخرطوم،
holds a BSc in
كما حصل على
engineering from
الدبلوم العالي في
Khartoum
التنمية والسياسات
University
العامة من نفس
and
الجامعة.
a higher diploma in
التحق بالعمل
development
السياسي في العام
studies
99 في جامعة
in
الخرطوم عبر تنظيم مؤتمر الطلاب
1999.
المستقلين،
He
وانتخب
joined the
عضوا
student
اتحاد الطلاب
movement
بجامعة
and
الخرطوم
was
وتولى
elected
موقع السكرتير
a
اللبناني
member
في العام
of the
2003.
Students' Union in
واصل السيد خالد عمر يوسف
2003.
نشاطه السياسي
Then he
عقب
continued
التخرج
his
بحزب المؤتمر
political
السوداني في العام
activity
2005،
after
وانتخب
graduating from
أمينا
university,
عاما للحزب في العام
and he
2007
was
كأحد أصغر
elected
من
a
تولوا
general
مثل هذا الموقع في
secretary
الأحزاب
of the
السياسية السودانية،
party,
وتنقل في
being one
مواقعه في
of
الحزب
the
حيث تولى معاه
youngest
العلاقات الخارجية
secretary
وصار نائب
generals
رئيس
in the
الحزب في العام
Sudan,
2016،
and
ومن
then
ثم
he
عاد لتولي
became the
الأمانة العامة
deputy
مرة أخرى في العام
leader of the
2018،
party. Then in
وهو عضو تنسيقية
2018
تحالف الحرية
um,
والتغيير، وهي الجسم
went back
القيادي
to
للتحالف
being
الذي
the
قاد حوار
secretary
ثورة
general.
ديسمبر
He was
2018
amongst the
وقمة
leaders
تمديد التحالف
of
حاليا.
the
وتقلد موقع وزير
2018
شؤون مجلس الوزراء في
revolution,
فبراير
and he
2021 في
became
الحكومة
Minister
الانتقالية
of
والتي
State
أزاحها الجيش عن
for
السلطة في
the
أكتوبر من ذات العام.
for
يسرني
cabinet
مرة أخرى
affairs.
الترحيب بالسيد خالد.
It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Khalid once again.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening, and thank you, Dr. Ghassan, for presenting me, and for our thanks to the center for providing us with the opportunity to meet you all, and my sincere gratitude to all those who took the time and trouble to join us this evening to discuss the situation in the Sudan currently. And I may have mentioned to some friends an anecdote when I was talking to some friends about this lecture and the talk about opportunities, and they said what you will do is you will go through all the challenges and conclude by saying there'll be no opportunities, thank us and go home. Yes, indeed, the situation does look gloomy in Sudan, but maybe it's our destiny, all of us, that we should not be over optimistic or over pessimistic without we should always have a bit of I remember Dr. Abdul Rahman was the provost of the university. He once said that he said to me, Khalid, don't, in your talk, don't say that we are going through a dangerous juncture, because for the last 40 years I've been hearing speakers repeating that our hope is to find a way out and safely pass this dangerous slope. Although there are no certainties in the world of politics, but in the short time of this talk, I'll try to allude to some of the opportunities in the hope of benefiting from our previous experiences and do something for the future. A democratic transition in the world is going through crisis, and maybe even more than what happened in 2021, and the international reports speak that now maybe 45% of the world's population can live under regimes which can be described as democratic. Even countries like France, for example, in the last elections there were many indicators of pointing to the fact that maybe 80% of the population were not enthusiastic. Some even said that they wouldn't mind even if the army took over. Maybe this is going too far in feeling desperate vis-a-vis the democratic entities, but democracy is not an end in itself, it's a means, and of course they say democracy is the worst of all the rest of the systems, or the worst of the better than the worst. But I remember when Samantha Power visited us in Khartoum months before the coup, she met Dr. Abdullah Hamdouk, and she told him that from an academic point of view, that Sudan is defining the graffiti, that Sudan is going against the international trend when democracy is on the retreat, but Sudan is moving forward despite the setback of the 25th of October coup. The democratic movement in the Sudan is very strong, although the coup of the 25th of October was a major setback, but they, and after 9 months of the coup, they cannot achieve one step forward simply because of the strength of the popular pro-democracy movement. When we talk about democratic change, in fact, democratic transition is highly complex and has many dimensions, and there is no two experiences which are similar. Every country has its own peculiarities and specificities, and some analysts refer that and understand that through economic forces or social forces or the ability of some rich countries being able to influence poorer countries, and some theories link democratic change to cultures. Some cultures are more conducive than others to democratic change. Some theories talk about the political class struggle. All of these theories fell short of a comprehensive explanation. All these factors and theories have an influence, but analysts almost agree that the choices by the main players will have a main influence in determining in which direction things are moving. And this also shows that democratic change does not necessarily mean that democracy itself can be a means to settle the differences, and sometimes people agree on limits and determinants to expand the base of participation and minimize the negative impacts of power struggles, and civil liberties and basic rights are therefore protected. Since the independence, the Sudan has continued to be in a state of conflict. Sudan is one of the most diverse countries in the region, so it's always been difficult to agree on one system, and ultimately, Sudan was divided into two countries and is likely to be divided even further into more than two countries. Despite that, there is no alternative to democratic rule. You cannot rule Sudan through one party or one group or one component. What the Sudan needs, everybody to be represented and their rights are protected, and the basis of equal opportunity, and the state should represent them, their ideas, ideals, culture, etc. This is a condition, a precondition for protecting the integrity of the country. The Sudanese, on the other hand, have never, not even for one day, given up on their attempt to seek a just system in the Sudan, despite the Sudanese struggled against the Egyptian Turkish occupation until they managed to liberate their country. Ultimately, in 1885, they liberated Khartoum, and from 1899 until 1956, they struggled until gained their independence. They stood up to the coup by Aboud and Nameri and Bashir until in 2021 against the coup by Al Burhan. So continuously, the civil movement for democracy has always been steadfast. Sudan had to endure 52 years of military rule, and maybe the political parties have been impacted to a great deal by despotism and dictatorships, yet, but no force managed to uproot this movement or break the will and the struggle against dictatorship and the resistance by the Sudanese people to all these despotic regimes. From the morning of the 30th of July until the moment when al-Bashir's regime fell, the demands remain the same, and that is to get rid of the dictatorship and regain the democratic rights for the people. One of the most important features of the December Revolution is the expansion of the civil and democratic forces which uphold the principle of democratic transition, so much so that the political grassroots and the bases of support have been expanding even more. The idea of military rule was not a strange one to Sudanese people. There were ways and means of living and cohabitating with this kind of military rule. Now, by and large, the Sudanese people feel that this is no longer possible. I think the latest statement by the military junta indicates that, because although the military have always been able to withstand the pressures, but they never resorted to the tactic of going back to their barracks. Al-Bashir remained in power for 30 years, but the 25th of October coup has reached this conclusion after 9 months only, and now they are talking about giving up power. So therefore, if we look at the democratic change as a process and as a cumulative process, nobody can deny that we are on the right path. From 1956 until now, the struggles by people has achieved a conclusion that the civilians cannot accept living under military rule. Having said that, we must also understand that if democratic change and transition is a gradual process, that we cannot achieve all the results in one go. And maybe this is part and parcel of the current debate, that the movement, the pro-democracy movement now is divided into two: people who stick to the basics and people who are not so adherent to these principles and accept compromises, etc., etc. And I think all of these people, all their functions in the movement against the military rule, they all call for the kind of people who have demands which can be described as fundamental, and I think all of them are fundamentalists in that sense. Some maybe have more patience and they think long term and they think of prioritizing their strategic goals. The problem is some still are of the opinion that everything can be achieved in one go and with one blow, and this is dangerous because in fact this puts in jeopardy the democratic movement, it says, and itself, and anybody who wants to lead the movement towards democratic change should appreciate that the previous experience until now has, when you discuss the attitudes of the leaders who sometimes sounded like they this attitude should be adopted and that should not, on one hand, and another trend which used to this kind of defects and shortcomings as a methodology to start labeling people as traitors rather than just say simply they did not perform well and be able to understand their mistakes. Neither approach is right, because if you adopt this kind of attitude, this would only lead to all factions being more entrenched in the positions and less able to maneuver and be flexible. This period of transition was built on a certain balance of power. We have to say this very clearly. Some people say that in the previous experience until now was problematic simply because the army was part of it and it made up one of the components of it. But people must also understand that this equation, which came into existence 3 years ago, was not because of the will of one party. What created this equation was the balance of power on the ground. On the 6th of April, the forces of liberty and change decided to organize a march of 1 million people moving towards the army's headquarters. They approached the high command of the army, requesting them to side with the people and stand against the leadership of Omar al-Bashir and the Muslim Brotherhood and change the country from a country of one single party to a country of the entire country. It was only natural that 99% of the work was achieved by the masses who marched towards the army's headquarters. 1% took it upon themselves to arrest Omar al-Bashir and take him to a secure location. Of course, both sides have played a role in deposing the previous regime. For this reason, when we entered into discussion on the 13th of April with the army, and people who led the marches outside the army's HQ wanted to meet with the command of the army. The military wanted to have a military high command, a junta, ruling junta, for 2 years, and then change will happen. The civilians said, no, we cannot allow that. We cannot allow to have full military control over the situation to avoid a repetition of the 1985 experience. We want, they insisted, we want a civilian government And on this basis, the negotiations between the civilians and the military started. The military had clear objective that the real authority and power should be in the hands of the civilians, and it was okay for the military to have a symbolic role. Even the symbolic role which is enshrined in the constitution or the constitutional document is one thing, but the balance of power on the ground was such that the masses who went out in their millions throughout the Sudan who wanted to depose the Bashir regime. This was the source of power for the civilians because they are one bloc, one project, and the military have their power based on the arms they carry and the money they possess. The balance of power, this balance of power was reflected in the document, the constitutional document, and this document gave the full executive power to the civilian government, and 67 of that for the forces for liberty and change, and the rest to other civilian factions. The Council of Sovereignty or Sovereign Council was the center of struggle because basically they wanted the military wanted 7 military and 3 civilians, and the other side wanted the opposite. Then somebody suggested to go half and half, but the civilians insisted that it should be a civilian council. The fact is, it could have been possible to, on the 50-50 division before the storming the sittings, and but the military wanted to have control, but the civilians wanted the civilian civil will to have full control. In the end, the situation was as it was. So therefore, the constitutional document reflected the balance of power on the ground in that moment. And
إذا نحن حافظنا على توازن القوى لمصلحة القوى مع التحول المدني الديمقراطي.
For the achievement of democratic transformation or transition, so here they can rely on the main force. So the military establishment has funds, has money, has weapons, and the civil movement has the support of the street, of the people, and also the strength and the power of the authority through the constitutional document, which is an added value when it comes to the strength of the street and of the power, in addition to money and in addition to the authority of the street. So if the people can use all these authorities, all of them, the result consequently is going to lead to a democratic transformation or transition. And if the situation is the opposite case, then there's going to be a coup. And perhaps for the military establishment, this matter was very, very clear when they signed the constitutional document. They had a strategy in order to change the balance of power in the future, and at the end of the day, these are adversaries, and this adversarial situation continued. But at the end, what you do, the acts that you undertake, is what would entail whether your adversary is going to be successful or not. So they did not stick to these two components. This is the reason why they have failed. And in that sense, as I mentioned, in the freedom and change or transformation workshop, we talked about these components. So to be fair, so it was the only civil component in the group that came out and said that it made a mistake. But all the other parties, all the other components have made mistakes that have changed the situation in favor of the military establishment. As an example, so first, so the political party was not able to preserve its freedom. Some others, they decided to leave the party. So the Ummah party, they froze their work, and also the professionals gathering or group, also the communists also, they left in November 2020, and also they adopted the line whereby they wanted to topple the transitional government. And what is important here, this is something that is very, very clear. Everybody remembers that in December 2016, so the Islamists, they prepared a Zahf al-Akhdar, or the green move. And this was one of the steps that were undertaken. So they were not able to change the situation, that any dynamism that took place at the time, it was not possible to be approved because of the situation. But the revolution that adopted the position which was against the transition have made the Islamists wear a revolutionary kind of cloak. So so any person that belonged to the previous regime or was loyal to the previous regime, and if that person would have said anything, he would have been applauded by the people in the streets. But after that, the situation became mingled, not very clear, so people did not differentiate between the revolutionaries and non-revolutionaries. So I compared this story to the story of Al-Khawarij. So when I mentioned Al-Khawarij, I did not refer to any particular political party or any person. I talked about the phenomenon as a result, as a whole. So Al-Khawarij killed Ali, God bless his soul, and the justification of the killing was that they were much more Muslim than Ali ibn Abi Talib was. So this was their justification. So this was the concept that I leaned on when I compared the situation. So that is why we have seen what has happened in the transitional phase. And if this is not reviewed, the pathway is going to remain as it is now. One of the problematics that we're facing, so yes, the aim was to change of the balance of power, but there should be a move in order to expand the political base, and there is no transitional period or move that might happen without expanding the base. So this cannot happen at a kind of a limited base. So there should be an expansion. But at the end of the day, because the situation is not a situation where we want to pinpoint to who is good or bad, who is accused, who is not accused. So this is not the objective. So what we wanted to underline here is that there should be a larger, much more expanded base. If you would like to discard the military establishment, you have to have a much larger base in order to do that. A small base would not be able to discard the military
يعني واحدة من الخطايا بتاعت الانتقال انه بدل ما الناس يمشوا في اتجاه توسيع القاعدة بتاعت الانتقال تفتتت الكتلة نفسها البدنية الثورية وضاقت قدرتها على التعبير. طبعا برضو من المشاكل اللي واجهت الفترة الانتقالية اللي فاتت انه يعني مهام الانتقال كانت عبارة عن ويش ليست. يعني
transition
إنه إحنا
included
كنا
only a
بنظن
wish
بين
list.
عشية وضحاها
So,
إنه كل مشاكل السودان يمكن معالجتها
so
الآن
we thought that all
بدون ترتيب
problems of
واضح
Sudan
للأولويات
would be
شنو يعني.
solved instantly. This was the problem that we
المهام
faced.
الكثيرة في نفس الوقت
And
يعني على سبيل المثال
many
الحكومة
duties
الانتقالية
that
الأولى
were
خدت
there
10 مهام
were
حاجة
overwhelming.
دايرة
So the transitional
النهاية النتيجة بتكون إنه أنت ما
government
حتعمل ولا واحد في
said that it is
العشرة
going to
أو
have
حتعمل
10
جهد ما كافي
main
في العشرة
objectives and
ويظهر
duties,
overall
and
يعني
when
في
they try
مشكلة
to
في
look
الأداء
at
يعني.
all of
دي
them,
حاولت
they
تصلحها الحكومة الثانية بأنها هي
realized that they were not
قلصت
able to
برنامج
achieve all
الأولويات
the
العشرة لأولويات
objectives.
خمسة
After
إنه
that,
شنو
they
أهم 5 حاجات من العشر حاجات دي
reckoned
عشان
that
الناس
this was
يركزوا فيها.
not
لكن
possible,
بعدها
that they would not be able to
يعني
concentrate
لو ما
on
كان
all
واضح
those
من
10
الأول إن
objectives,
الأولوية
so
رقم
they
واحد شنو
reduced the
الناس
list into
يعني صبوا
5
جهودهم
main
فيها
objectives and
يعني
priorities.
النتيجة كان
So,
حتكون واضح إنه الحاجة اللي حصلناها هسه
as a result of that,
في وضعية السودان الحالية دي الأولوية رقم واحد هي الإصلاح
the
الأمني والعسكري والجيش الواحد.
priority that we have
السودان
today
غير
in
قابل
Sudan
للاستمرار كدولة
is
واحدة مع
security,
استمرار مسألة تعدد الجيوش
reform, and social
ما
reform.
ممكن
These
أصلاً
are two
السودان يستمر
components
دولة
that we
واحدة
should
ناهيك عن إنه
concentrate
يحصل فيه
on.
تحول ديمقراطي
So,
ولا ما يحصل فيه تحول ديمقراطي
in order to achieve
الجيوش المتعددة
democratic
الموجودة الآن يعني القوات
transition and
المسلحة، الدعم
transformation.
السريع، الحركات المسلحة وكل الجيوش الموجودة دي
All the armies that
كل
exist
الجيوش
now,
الموجودة دي
all the armies that
بما
exist,
فيها القوات
including
المسلحة
the
نفسها
armed forces themselves,
عندها مشكلة
they
حقيقية
have a real
في مسألة
problematic
التعبير
when it comes to
عن تعدد
expressing
وتنوع السودان
the
بصورة
diversity
عادلة
of Sudan, reflecting the
ناهيك طبعا عن
diversity and
الحركات
pluralism
ولا
of Sudan,
الدعم السريع اللي هم
and this
يعني أقل قومية
includes
يعني وأقل
all the
تطبيق
other
عن
military movements
السودانيين
and not
ككل يعني.
only the armed
وبالتالي
forces. And
خطورة السلاح
consequently,
ده إنه السلاح ده هو ذاته
the
منتشر على خطوط التقسيم
danger
العرقي
and the
والإثني والجهوي
critical point lies
في
in the
السودان.
fact
ولو
that
بدأت في حرب في
weapons
السودان
are
بدأت
spread all over the place, and
بين الجيش
if
والدعم السريع ما
a
بتنتهي بين
war
الجيش والدعم
erupts,
السريع بتتحول لحاجة
the
ثانية
war
يعني
is
نفس
not going to be
الحروب
between
اللي
two
كانت موجودة بين القوات
main
المسلحة وبين الحركات
components
المسلحة
such as
يعني
the
وفي
armed
دي أنا حاجي لها
forces
برضه في موضوع
and
يعني شرح حول
the
طبيعة الانقلاب الحالي
دعم السريع.
بالتالي غياب
So it is going to
الإصلاح الأمني والعسكري
expand to
كأولوية
include
وعدم
all
التقدم فيها يعني
representatives
بصورة
of the
حقيقية
people.
ده كان واحد من
So
مقايضات
that is
الانتقال
why
واحدة من النقاط اللي بيها
one of the
الانتقال في
points
النهاية
that
برضو
have been
طبعا
underlined is this particular point when
يعني
we
طبعا
talked
نحن
about
برضو في
transition.
محيط إقليمي
So
ودولي
also we have to take into
بصراحة يعني
account
معادل الانتقال
the
السودان
regional
كان
and
عبارة عن جزيرة
international
ديمقراطية في بحر من
entourage. So Sudan at
الشموليات
some point in
المحيطة
time we were a
وبالتالي
democratic island, if we may
بالتالي
call it so,
متوقع
within a
يكون
sea
في موقف
of
عدائي من
authoritarian
الناشئة
regimes.
في
So
السودان
that is why
والطبيعي
we
إنه طبعا
understand
لما
the
نتكلم عن ده ما معناه
animosity that
الاستسلام
was expressed by some
لكن لازم
vis-a-vis
يتم وضعه
such kind
برضو
of
في الاعتبار.
democracy
طيب
that existed at some
حدثت
point in
كارثة
time.
الانقلاب
So we
25
have had
أكتوبر
the coup on the
والوصف بتاع
25th
الماضي
of
مش عشان
October.
نحبس روحنا في الماضي عشان
And
نشوف نحن في المستقبل دايرين
so
نمشي لوين
we
بالضبط.
have to see
لكن
what
عشان نعرف
we
نحن
want
نمشي
to
لوين
do in the
لازم
future,
نفهم
where we
التركيب
want to
بتاع
head.
الانقلاب ده بصورة
And in order to
صحيحة.
understand the situation, we
طبعاً
have to understand,
الانقلاب
in order to understand
الانقلاب مش
what we're
مرة
going
على
to do, we
السودان.
have to
عفواً، الانقلاب
understand
مرة
the
على
situation.
البشرية يعني ما في انقلاب
So
بالضعف
there is
بتاع انقلاب 25 اكتوبر. ليه؟ لانه اولا
no military
هو
coup
انقلاب
that
مكون من 3 رئيسين. أي
includes
رأس
only
فيهم
one component.
عنده
So
أجندة مختلفة
the coup that
totally
we
من
had included
الرأس الثاني.
three
ومكون من
main
فئة القوات
persons, three main
المسلحة، الدعم
components
السريع،
with
ومن
different
تيارات المؤتمر الوطني
kind of
الجبهة الإسلامية.
perspectives and ideas,
الثلاثة ديل
including the different
يعني
groups
ما
in
مشتركين
Sudan,
كانوا في أي
including
حاجة
الدعم
غير
السريع and so
رغبتهم
on.
في قطع الطريق قدام
So
التحول
this
دي الحاجة الوحيدة اللي متفقين فيها.
was an
لكن كانوا
impediment. So this is one of the
وبالعكس
issues that we had faced
بمجرد
at
ما
the
إنه
time.
هم يعني أزاحوا الحرية والتغيير خارج المشهد
So when they moved the Freedom and Transformation Party, so they had one enemy that unified them or that united them, but that enemy no longer existed. So, and the armed forces did not want to see the rapid intervention be part of what was taking place. And also, the Islamists also wanted to get rid of both components. So, they were not, the Islamists also wanted to get rid of both components, so the armed forces and also the rapid intervention representatives or movement. because for them they are both part of the military establishment. That is why these internal conflict within the coup camp has weakened the situation, and this has led the civilians reach a wrong conclusion. So they thought that the situation or that these establishments are going to collapse very quickly and by themselves. And this is not true. If you do not meet what is required, this is not going to lead anywhere. And also, the weakness of the coup has led to something very negative among civilians. So people started thinking about the aftermath of the coup, what is going to be looted and taken as a result of the coup, instead of thinking what is going to be achieved first and foremost before we reach the end point. So they started with the distribution of power. So the coup had not finished yet before the power would be distributed. So you have not come to the end of the situation. So you have to reach the end of the coup and then start distributing the results that had been harvested as a result of that. So this was one of the mistakes that were committed. So it is very important, yes, indeed, to think about what will happen after the coup, but you have to think about what should be met, the duties that should be carried out. And so unity is very important. Without unity, no military coup would be successful. There would not be any settlements, nothing of such would be achieved if a military coup is not successful. So we have to agree on these concepts first and foremost, and also the tools, the means that are going to be undertaken, and after that you think about what happened after. You should not keep on thinking about the second step before finishing the first one. So this is not going to be possible. So you cannot start thinking about these things before you finish the first steps. Are you going to sell the sheep? Are you going to sell the milk that you're going to get out of the sheep? You cannot start thinking about the trophies and the booties before you reach that particular point where you start making those gains. But what is critical is that the coup, because it was so weak, it was not able to continue. So Sudan is open to many, many scenarios, except the fact that people in power cannot continue for too long. This is the only thing that cannot be achieved due to the many, many discrepancies and contradictions and weaknesses. This is not possible. This weakens the state itself. So yes, the coup failed to create any political support. So they have not been able to create a kind of a political support or incubator, and the alternative is a social kind of support or program. So yes, there is competitiveness. That is why the social base, this is something that they want to achieve, and this is not against us. No, this is not against our endeavors, but this leads to more ethnic, tribal, racial polarization in Sudan. And as a result of that, we do witness an increase in the level of tribal violence, and this is a reflection, a natural reflection of what is happening. In Jamina, he said that and what he said was right. He said that the social contradictions and tribal contradictions, and also the high level of armaments that we see at the level of tribes, this leads to more military coups. And what is happening is what is happening. We're going to see an increase in the level of polarization. So what is critical is that due to the fact that there is this polarization, we see a spread of weapons. And what is more dangerous is that even the persons that carried out the coup, their coalitions, local and international coalitions, they contribute to that. We have seen the reports that was issued by CNN. So the report talked about the smuggling of gold from Sudan into Russia. So this puts Sudan in a pathway of international clashes and conflicts. Sudan tries to establish alliances and coalitions in order to limit and alleviate the level of political isolation. But in such acts that are committed, this leads to further isolation. This is very, very critical. And this would lead to the disintegration of Sudan, the dismantlement of Sudan. That is why this matter should be tackled seriously. So what does this mean? It means that we have to understand that the situation in Sudan is very compounded, and therefore this requires compounded solutions. You cannot come up with miraculous solutions. You should not think that you can find solutions in one go, by one blow, and the situation is going to be solved altogether. If the problem is compounded and complex, therefore, this entails that solutions should be compounded in keeping with the problem itself, or problems themselves. So I've made you really, really pessimistic, really, I know that, but I am optimistic. I have to tell you that the military are not going to stay on because there is an opportunity. So the head of the coup said that we want to go back to our barracks, and this was never said before, and this is happening due to the isolation that we witness and due to the popular rejection of the situation. So this is why the commanders of the coup have taken out to the street to say that they want to go back to their barracks. So that is why we have to revisit the situation, redefine the situation. I have said at the beginning of my intervention, I said that democratic transition is a very unique phenomenon. So even in one state, it is not possible to implement the same formula once, twice, and 3 times. You cannot do that because it will not be successful. On the 6th of April, the mission was to discard the Islamic Front, and the equation entailed at the time to include both military and civilians to do so. But now the mission is to discard the military. And the formula is not going to be the same. We cannot go to the central command and tell them that. So, because now the aim is to remove the military, and the mission, the duty is different, and therefore the tools should be different. One of the most important preconditions when it comes to discarding the military establishment from power, to do that, we have to have a large social base that believes in such endeavor, and to have what is called Revolution Plus. because the revolutionaries would not be able to do that on their own. And instead of limiting the definitions, I think we can create a large social base that would demand the removal of the military establishment from power. There are some persons say that there are some movements that have a conspiracy with the commanders that carried out the coup in Sudan. No. What we should do is that we should ask the armed forces to rectify the acts that had been committed. So that is why Abdel Wahid had been asked to stand with the social movement and supported. We in the freedom movement, we did not accept to do that. So the more we limit the base, the more we're going to make the mission much easier for the military establishment. So because there are some movements that think that democratic transformation or transition is not a priority, is not important. And if it is important, then we have to work in order to achieve that. And this methodology should be established, should be achieved at a much larger base. All those who believe in democratic transition, they should be with us in the camp that calls for the discarding and removal of the military establishment from power. So all of them, those who are for democratic transition and those who belong to different camps, all of them should unify their ranks in order to achieve our main objective. In our movement, as I have mentioned, we would like to agree with a larger base of civilians to agree on the alternative, the constitutional details, to talk about the civil trait of transitional power, and also to start forming the institutions that should take part and be part of the transitional phase, and talk about the different components of this transitional phase that should reflect the pluralism, the diversity of Sudan. And after that, we can have the elections. These elections should not be a tool of control. So this is an open project for all the forces that want to take part in this democratic transition. So this is the discourse that should be adopted, because this is a patriotic matter, and we should not allow people to have different discourses that are against the pathway that we want to achieve, the pathway that is in the interest of our homeland, in the interest of our people. Because if we have these contradictory kind of discourses, this is going to open the door wide open for the destruction and collapse of Sudan. So the democratic movements, the democratic transition should aim to discard the military establishment. The second duty should entail that there should be military reform. So when the military comes and hands over the keys of the presidential palace, we should be able to help this military establishment, train the military establishment. So we cannot have transitional preparations and arrangements that would lead to democracy in Sudan, that would dispense Sudan with any collapse or dismantlement without comprehensive reforms taking place. This roadmap is not going to be delineated only by the military establishment. That is why the commander, when he talked about the Armed Forces Council is going to be established by the military, we did not accept, because it is not the military that should delineate these very important institutions and establishments. No. So this should not be done solely by the military. I have heard a person who talked about a radical change in Sudan, who said that we should have a kind of a civil council or a civil commission that was disband the military, but this is not going to lead to any good solutions, because it is not linked to the situation on the ground. So it does not reflect the situation on the ground. So you want the military to be outside the political life and social life. So they have to concentrate on their duties as per the constitution to defend the integrity of the state and defend the people of Sudan. So this should be part of the discussion. So they should have an interest in doing so. So you are not have an agreement that is going to be a win-lose agreement. The military establishment should understand that this democratic transformation or transition is not only in the transition of the civilians, it is in the interest of the whole people. So, because the elite for 52 years had been using or taking advantage of the military establishment for its own interests. So because the military should defend the borders of the state, and the situation has aggravated because the latest coup has made the military establishment enter into confrontation with the many popular movements and components of the state. Yes, the military should be a national patriotic military, but this was be based on a civil democratic state that would delineate the lines between the different institutions and also pave the way for a democratic transition, and also to save the country, rescue the country from any repercussions that might happen in the future. Yes, there are so many impediments, but it is possible to happen. There are so many countries that have faced similar weaknesses and helpless situations, but they were able to go beyond their difficulties and their weaknesses in order to establish strong countries. And this is possible for us as long as there is a belief, there is awareness that we have to continue with the different acts that would lead to such results. Sudan is a great people, and they have to achieve their dream and may the peace and blessings of God.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. To keep within the time limit, we will take 3 questions each round, and please state your name, your position, and pose your question. Thank you very much. My question to Khalid Omer Yousif. Muhammad Al-Fiqh Sulaiman on his Twitter page yesterday said that a government will be formed in 2 weeks. Have you sat down with the resistance committees in 18 cities and the representatives of the Communist Party? Thank you very much. Faisal Amra, a journalist. First of all, we would like to thank the Center for this activity. It's a center well known in attempting to solve problems. This is very important that you provide a platform for discussion. I have 2 comments to make. The revolutionary activities have been repeatedly gone. The first sit-in lost and hindered the opportunity to establish a revolutionary authority. Now we have 4 blocks: the resistance committees, then the liberties and change, the national coalition, and the original group, then the 4th group. How can you, all these different blocks, coordinate together? All these revolutionary forces seem to me have ignored an important faction, and that is the Sudanese in the diaspora. And the revolutionaries in the diaspora are full-heartedly supporting the revolution. Why don't you try to approach them? And this bloc can play an important role. The forces for liberty and change until now could not address properly the international forces, and the latest resolution by the Security Council and its article number 17 says the matter is still under consideration. Why don't you try and approach the countries who support the revolution, organizations like the GCC, the Council of Europe, especially that some have expressed support for the people of Sudan. My name is Muqtas Muhammad Tahir. I am an engineer. Apart from determining the priorities and what the government of liberty and change has done, we have not found until now a clear strategy for structuring the state. For example, ministries, legislations, constitutions, neither the administrative side so far as the different governorates are concerned. Of course, neither you nor the resistance committees have reached this stage. Secondly, we keep repeating the same thing, and we use the word technocrats. Until now, have not found the technocrats who are good politicians. Even the best technocrats cannot be good ministers. Why do we still use them and we still call for them? Finally, we mentioned that the Al-Burhan discourse and the Hamitti discourse and the differences between them. You did not elaborate on that. First of all, thank you for all your questions. The first question about the statements by Muhammad, I think these statements were not interpreted well. The revolutionary forces are in the process of coordinating with other forces on the ways of forming a government, the period of transition, the different objectives. Of course, this will include all the forces. It will include the resistance committees and everybody. We are determined to do that. I said we look forward to expand the grassroots. We do not want to exclude anybody, any revolutionary force, whether it's the Communist Party or although the Communist Party used to close the door continuously every time we found mechanisms to increase collaboration, they did not respond. The second question by Faisal, calling for the announcement of a revolutionary government. Even if we were to do that when the sitting was going on, the power was in those days and now was and still is in the hands of the military. So you really needed to sit down and negotiate terms and conditions with them. I think the assumption that the civilians can announce and form a government and run the country single-handedly on their part, I think this reflects a lack of understanding of the real how the balance of power on the ground. I think in the past they exercised real power. Now they're announcing or negotiating surrender, more or less. We wanted the constitutional document to state clearly that power should be in the hands of the civilians, and I think if you refer to it, you will find that evidently clear. As for the Sudanese in the diaspora, I agree with you. The Sudanese are everywhere. The best of our talents are spread all over the world, and the transitional period has failed in attracting them, although there has been a number of initiatives, but they were doomed to failure, more or less. Now I think the opportunity is there, and part of the responsibility should be shared with the Sudanese in the diaspora. Even in the new thinking and what Mu'tasim has said about reforming the state apparatus, the role of the Sudanese in the diaspora can be played, and they can help people inside the country, sometimes in the midst of preoccupation with the nitty-gritty of daily political activity, we forget that. But I think so far as addressing the international forces, I think our forces did not really fail in that. We have done what we could have done, and international actors in the end act according to their own motives and interests, and we do not have control over that. As for the question by Mu'tasim, I think one of the biggest problems that we inherited from the al-Bashir regime is the damage done about the structure of the state, now we are approaching internationally renowned organizations to provide us with advice to reform the civil service. Now the civil service in Sudan is in a dire condition. It cannot perform, it cannot do its duty, and the Sudan still needs a political dialogue between the different political actors, and also to take care of the technical side so that people can benefit from the best practices known in the world. As for the form of the government, the forces of liberty and change, we think that the nature of the transitional period is a political one. We believe in the role of the technocrats, but we do not want ultimately to have a government based on a quota system between the different parties, and you end up with a minister without any real ability and efficiency, but the post is given to him or her simply because this is the share of a certain political party, and regardless of technocrats, whether they belong to a political party or not, we insist on them having the qualifications and the ability to fulfill the position given to them.
Thank you. I'm Ashraf Siddiqui, a journalist from Pakistan in Qatar. This is not first time and not the only country, Sudan, which is facing regular expeditions by the militaries. Even in Pakistan, we have gone through a couple of times. The same way Sudan. There are lucky countries like Turkey that who overcome. How you see the role of politicians, Sudanese politicians, in bringing and supporting some of these generals to take over? How you see the role of politicians in that, bringing in the militaries in the government, like in Pakistan?
Thank you, Muhammad Al-Amin Tarrash. First of all, I think there was a strategic mistake committed by the forces for liberty and change. Before the demise of the previous regime, most of the parties belonging to this bloc said they will not take part in any transitional period. These documents are there, statements are there in the time of the Sudanese Congress Party, the Al-Ummah Party, and others. They all said we will be just observers and will not take up any executive power. After the demise of the al-Bashir regime, they all took part in the executive. I think this was an act of treason so far as their own documents and statements. And this was something they committed before the military. Ultimately, there is a street and there is a people you commit to through your statements, then you negate on your promises. I think this led to the isolation of the freedom and change. For example, you, Khalid, said that when you participated in the actual ruling of the country, strengthened you. I think the opposite is true. It has weakened you. when you were part and parcel of the government, you excluded many people. You did not expand the grassroots, as you're saying now, and like the committees of resistance and the traditional communities. I think the military is sort of approaching them, whereas you have managed to isolate yourselves even further. Secondly, Mr. Khalid, you said the coup has three heads: the military, the rapid intervention, and liberty and change. You forget the armed militias and groups. Do you think they were not? They did not form any part? You think the military coup is weak because there is tribal violence. But you know that even when you were in power, there was tribal conflict in Darfur and others in the 3 years that you were in power. I don't think we can consider the tribal violence as an indication that the military coup is weak. As for expanding what you're talking about expanding the grassroots and including every group who is keen on democratic transition, there is talk that some Islamist trends are calling for democratization. Does what you said include them? Thank you very much. السلام عليكم. Dr. Khalid Ahmed Al-Hajab Al-Tarafi from Toronto University and Qatar University. I'll ask you a very clear question about the Juba Agreement and the armed militias. You said this is the priority number one in the Sudan, and you are correct in saying that. But what is your assessment of the Juba Agreement now, and what are the clear points that you will choose to solve the problem of arms, disarming the groups and integrating these armed groups to the community and transferring them into political parties? So therefore, without changing these militias into the democratization progress, we'll always have spoilers. If you have a clear vision, please state that vision.
Regarding your question, historically in Sudan, the political parties played a role in bringing the military into politics because, for example, at 1958, the first coup, the former Prime Minister Abdullah Khalil, he was representing Umma Party. Actually, he brought the military to take over because of internal political divisions. This was the same case at 1969, at 1989 as well. Certain political parties were behind the military. So it is similar. No military coup can happen without political and social incubator, which is not the case now in the 25th of October coup. They lacked the sufficient political and social base. That's why this coup is weak. But of course, things can change if the civilian committed mistakes. Now the opportunity that the civilians should agree to take the military out of power forever and to solve their differences through civilian ways, not by bringing the military into power. That's why there is a golden opportunity for the Sudanese right now. It is up to us whether to take the chance or repeat our previous mistakes. And
there are a number of questions. The first question, your name, please. Kharashi. So we'd like to start with the disrespect of the different covenants. So this is history that they did not want to change. First and foremost, so the freedom and transformation forces, they formed the first transitional government in 2019, which was a technocrat government, and they have respected the promise that they're not going to take part in the transitional government, and the forces, they have changed their position. They said that not participating is not a correct decision and that we should take part. So politics is an ever-changing kind of practice. It is not something that is constant and does not change. So that is why there is no disloyalty in this matter. This is a revisiting of positions that entails that there should be new strategies. So there is nothing that is constant in politics. There's no such thing as constant positions in politics. I did not say that the power should be in the hands of freedom and transformation. No, I talked about power in the hands of civilians. So the constitutional document gave them real power to have a council, to have a constitutional and legislative council, and to have the resources of a state, and to be able to oversee the police and the military and and the security apparatus. This is something that should be in the hands of the civilians, not the freedom and transformation. No. And this is the mistake that some have fallen in, thinking that it is just something that should be shouldered by the freedom and transformation. So there were different strategies, and some thought that for us to be able to have a stable relationship with the civilians, we should turn a blind eye to certain practices that are made, and some others who used to think that any confrontation with the military means that you're active and so on and so forth. And that you should not enter into any conflicting relationship with them, and you should take the situation lightly with them and should have some balanced relationship. So the lack of a unified strategy within civilians allowed the military establishment to penetrate and take more and more of the civilian power. So the problem is that we let go. We did not grab this power. So some people think that power is a means in the hands of Satan. No, this is wrong. If it is used in evilish acts, it is evil. If it is used in virtual acts, it is virtuous. So he cannot say that power is something that you put in a showcase and just watch it from far away. No. So the program I believe in should be manifested on the ground, and I am part and parcel, a member of a political party, and the means entails that we would like to come and reach power. And this is something that is natural, even in democracies. In democracies, when a person is elected or a political party is elected, he would or she would be in the highest peak of popularity, and then this would decline. I gave you the example of France. Before the latest elections, the opinion poll that was carried out in April 2022, 80% of French people were against all political parties. But the difference lies in what? The communities that establish firmly democracy, they do not have any alternatives. They have a conviction that there is no alternative but democracy. Our problem in Sudan, when our persuasion and conviction about certain political parties becomes limited or dwindles, we resort to other means. So we have to reach a phase where we understand that political parties have deficiencies, but there is no alternative but democracy and organized political action through institutions, through legitimate means that would be used of what would be useful to people. And when it comes to the different movements, the movements were not the main component or factor when it comes to the coup. I think they carried out a crime against themselves and against the peace agreement and against the values they sought and the values they fought for, the values they took to the street in order to achieve, for which they took to the street in order to achieve. So this was the situation. So when a person is ready to put himself or herself at stake, this is not something that is normal. You cannot take it lightly and simply. When you reach a high level of conviction, you can resort to weapons. You can fight. And these movements, they fought the Salvation regime, but they worked against their own principles. Many of them stood with the coup, but not all of them. Some of them did not. They are not in the driving seat. Some of them were on the margin of the coup, and the people that carried out the coup would have wanted to get rid of them. So that is why the position of those who stood with the coup, they have to revisit themselves and they have to understand that peace can only be secured through democracy. There's no peace without security. We cannot secure it. Agreements in Sudan have been signed within authoritarian regimes, Abuja and the Doha agreements, and Fajr, and so on and so forth. So all of these agreements have been signed by authoritarian rulers, and those rulers would stand against those agreements. So there are no guarantees unless this happens within a democratic framework. So these main forces are the Islamists, the military establishment, and also the rapid intervention or support or Dam as-Saria, the rapid intervention. So we talked about the Islamists and the participation. So the situation is very clear. I do not think that we should sideline any person because of his or her political or intellectual positions. So if there is an Islamic person or an Islamist that has not taken part in any crimes that have to happen, if he was not did not collude with any of those military coup acts, if they are against the coup and political transformation and democratic transformation, they should be invited. Yes, I know people through Facebook are going to criticize that, but this is the truth. You cannot sideline a person because of his or her ideas only. No. Our problem with the Islamists, we are part of the secular movement, the left movement, and we do not stand on par with these ideas, but we do think if we're talking about a democratic transformation, so this can only be achieved through diverse pathways. So all the movements should come forward. And our problem with the Islamists, so we do not agree with their ideas. So those who should be sidelines are criminals, and not because of their ideas, no, because of their acts, their criminal acts. Those who have ruled the country have stolen funds, money, killed. These persons should be sidelined. They should not take part in the political activities or political acts. And any person that aims to carry out a sidelining of persons because of the ideas of X or Y person, this is kind of an authoritarianism. This is authoritarian ideas that those persons want to implement. So there are persons that are not with the revolutionaries, they are against the coup, and they want to have a democratic transformation and transition. And these components should be part of this transition, and without their presence, this is not going to be a complete kind of move. With regard to the last question about the assessment of the Juba Agreement, so I think that the Juba Agreement is a problematic agreement. But the acts of the armed movements that colluded with the persons that carried out the coup, they harmed the agreement. So the security and military reform was not detailed in the document. It was just mentioned in general or not in detail. So the agreement set mechanisms, timelines, and parties, and also the participation of civilians. So when we talk about the agreement of Juba, the agreement talked about the policy would be carried out, and the agreement talks about these components, talking about the policies that should be implemented by the Council of Ministers, and also it should be observed by the Legislative Council. This was included in the Juba Agreement. So there is another example when it comes to the Juba Agreement. This is a very important achievement for Sudan. We have had previous experiences whereby we used to have revolutions, whereby we topple authoritarian regimes, come up with democracy, but we did not stop civil wars. So for the first time in the history of Sudan, a revolution leads to a peace agreement. Because at the end of the day, if there is an armed movement that has 10 persons carrying weapons, this is a problematic. So saying that this is a small group, a weak group, and therefore should not be included in a peace agreement, this is wrong. No, these persons have real grievances. They have resorted to using weapons because they have grievances, and peace can be only achieved through negotiations with all groups. And consequently, so the agreement included positives and negatives. Negatives such as the pathways that had been established and that were not linked to areas of armed conflict, such as the center, the north, and so on and so forth. This had deepened the many contradictions that existed. So this was one of the problematics of the Juba Agreement. The Juba Agreement, perhaps Sudan has some social balance. This was not complete during the war, and the peace agreement did not come to find solutions to these social problematics, and this had led to some counter concerns, irrespective whether these are real concerns, legitimate concerns or not. So you should not sideline them and ignore them. One of the problematics that were included also in this agreement, the Juba Agreement, there are problems that are part and parcel of the agreement when it comes also to the implementation of the agreement, when it comes to the security arrangements. This is one of the most important matter when it comes to integrating the different armies in the armed forces. And this should have been a priority. After the signing of the agreement, the priority was resorted to the institutions of transitional power, but issues of refugees, IDPs was not included as a priority and was not implemented. And consequently, this was added to the many deficiencies that existed in the text in the first place. So this is very important. There is another thing which is very important when it comes to the absence of reasoning. There are some people some time ago, they came up with a charter saying that they wanted to cancel the Juba agreement. They said, we've come up with the agreement and we are to cancel the agreement. So the lack of reasoning leads to what? So you're going to cancel the Juba agreement. And what are you going to do with the armed groups? Are you going to go back to the war? You're going to fight them. And after that, you're going to negotiate with them after that. And after negotiate, you're going to sign another Juba agreement. By then, 100,000 Sudanese would have died. So why wouldn't you, in the first place, if there is a problem with the agreement, so you cannot solve this unless you have direct negotiations, as simple as that. And this is the position that should be included. So if there are disagreements, the first thing you should say that we are committed to the implementation. You have said that we have to solve problems through direct negotiations. If there are any problematics, they should be solved. If this does not happen, it means that we're going to go back to war once again. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Awatif Abdul Latif, a media person and a social activist. I'm very sad indeed. In the whole world, the economy leads politics. Citizens are facing dire economic circumstances. And Mr. Khalid and most of the powers and forces, all of them, they talk to us, talk theoretically, but there are no solutions on the ground. The Sudanese revolution is the revolution of the people par excellence. But when we came to the distribution of seats, we have seen so many problematics. And now it is a difficult situation, particularly after the coup. But since the revolution started, Mr. Khalid, I would like to thank you. But what am I going to benefit? Talking about experiences of France and the Netherlands, the citizens are in a very difficult situation. There was no work plan. I used to be the former secretary of Mansour Khalid. I worked with him in the Dar al-Sahafa. I have nothing to do with the salvation and what has happened. You did not have any action plan. And you did not talk about how to protect and rescue the Sudanese people from the pit they fell in. So the revolution is the revolution of the Sudanese people, and the accusations that spread around you, all people in televisions, in media outlets, they try to justify. But some say that you take salaries from embassies. This is what is being talked about. But the citizens are facing very bleak and dire situations. So even people specialized in economy, they talk about different examples from France, from Netherlands. What about the problem, the situation on the ground? And even these experts, they disagree with each other. May the peace of God be upon you all. Thank you, Mr. Engineer Sami Ahmed. First of all, so the workshop by Freedom and Transformation was a good one because the people were asking many important questions. And this should have taken place in the Freedom Square. So it should be the Freedom Square for people to attend and see what has happened. I have a number of points. The first point, in one of your live interventions, you talked about Al-Mu'tamar al-Shabi. The popular conference is one of the forces that are against the coup. And I think any of the Islamists that are against the coup and any of them who do not want a military coup, they are using these arguments for consumption, political consumption. So the constitution and the relationship between religion and the state, this cannot wait for the conference to happen. You cannot tell us that we're going to have peace and after 4 years we're going to have a constitutional conference. Third, there are a number of lines, such as the armed movements and the Islamists that you talked about. So what you're talking about is very misleading when you say that the Islamists should not take part. You do not say that you're going to violate their rights, because as per the Constitution, you cannot do that. But when a person takes to the street, the person, if calls for killing other persons, this is a violation of social peace. This person should be imprisoned. But a person can express his ideas, her ideas, but this should not be in contradiction with the Constitution, whether these are Islamists or non-Islamists. The fourth point. There is an initiative. There is Prof. Nimr and others that talked about a revolutionary legislative council. These people have left all their duties in order to concentrate on that. I do not believe in technocrats. I believe a person should have a strategic vision and also a political party vision. The last point that I would like to talk about, I think the solution is not through a minimum level of freedom and transformation. No, there should be a permanent constitution, a concise constitution. A permanent constitution has nothing to do with Palestine and whether you pay zakat or not pay zakat. Constitution should guarantee the basic rights. And then in the legislations, we should look at this not being in contradiction with the rights of people. Those who want to sign can come to sign, and then those who do not, we would understand how they view the state and how it should be. Thank you. In the name of God, the most compassionate, Abu Bakr Hamd Ahmed, I would like to welcome Engineer Khalid. So democratic transformation, this is the first point. So democratic transition should have frank discussion and also reconciliation. It should be frank discussion between all political components and decision makers. And after that, a national reconciliation that would not sideline any person if we're talking about a constitution that reflects all the people, all their ambitions, all their ideas. Before the 25th of October, there was a prevailing description So there can be a military and the Islamists and armed movements with the civil movements that were against the salvation. After the 25th of October, this scene became different. So when we talk about the different components, such as the rapid intervention, that was a military arm of the civil component, and now we have these components outside authority and power. So in your description, in your proposals, you bet on the armed movements, and this could have been an opportunity in order to achieve civil peace and also to stop the bloodshed there. But working on sidelining the military and enabling the armed movements, this is an adventure that is full of risks. So it is clear that the Freedom and Transformation has announced a mandate that is not in keeping with the transitional rule. So we have found that there was a minister that was talking about things that are outside and not in keeping with the convictions of most people. And there were talks about things that incite people against each other. So these are the duties of a legitimate government, an elected government. So the main challenge that I wish you would be able to comment on, so you have used a mandate which was not the mandate of a transitional phase. So the mandate was a mandate of somebody in power already, and this is considered an act of dictatorship. May the peace of God be upon you. My name is Tasneem Dhahab. I have two questions. The first question, I would like to comment on the discourses of the different military representatives when they said they wanted to go back to their barracks. I think that this is a kind of a bait that they have used here in order to and there's also what is called a mirage. When they talked about the military coup as being a weak one. So the ones who supported the military coup are known. We know how they supported the military coup. And as I've said previously, you're not waiting for the military to concede the power willingly. No, there should be a method whereby you would be able to make them concede the power. So I would like to know what is the win-win situation that you talked about. So what is the plan that your movement has in order to make the military establishment concede power in the light of the different mistakes that were committed and also lack of a realistic reading of the situation? And also when you talked about the expansion of the popular base, you talked about the different armed movements and the popular base should not include political components. The popular base should also be a civilian base. So where does your support lie when it comes to the different unions, the private groups, and also popular committees? Since the coup till date, what have you done? What have you seriously done to guarantee the entry of these components into the popular base? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My question to Khalid. Please be brief. I want to know about what is the criteria which makes people take part in the transitional authority, because the committee of resistance was really treated unjustly in the past. From what you say, your point of view is close, too close maybe to Hamiti and the armed group. Why can't you sit down with Al-Burhan, form one unified army instead of rapid intervention, armed groups, etc., etc.? This is my question. My point too was so close to them that since the coup they imprisoned me 4 or 5 times. Please be brief, Your Excellency. Ms. Awatif's question first. What you said really is really a bit unfair to the revolution and not objective. First of all, let's in events like this, when people talk about we should not say certain things. But anyway, what you said is strong evidence that one of the most important achievements is that nobody managed to raise any questions about our financial integrity. When they wanted to falsify accusations, they accused certain people of stealing a TV set. So if the entire block of Freedom Unchained only stole one TV set, I think they should really erect a statue for them. And all the investigation proved that the previous regime was robbing and stealing the wealth of the nation. So therefore, part of the achievement was to open the floor for really investigating the previous regime. Of course, the people who carried out the military coup on the 25th of October are ruling the country for the last 9 months, not us. So they should bear responsibility. When in the period when we were in power, it was the first time that Sudan achieved a level of growth at around 1.7%. We solved the problems regarding providing the essential commodities like fuel, bread, etc. And despite the fact that these problems were the main reason for the demise of the previous regime. As for the debts, Sudan, since the 70s, has been accumulating debt, and the transitional government was the first government who managed to do something about this, so we cannot deny that there was any achievement. Of course, it's impossible to solve deep economic problems in a year or two, but there was clear progress reflected in the figures and statistics that the transitional government took care of the affairs of the people. As for the coup now, it's different. They have no source of legitimacy. Our legitimacy came from the fact that we represented people and we devoted our lives to improve the lot of the Sudanese. As for Mr. Samer, so far as the Popular Congress, they said that they are against the military coup of the 25th of October. I welcome that. I think it's rather naive that you can say to people that you're against the coup, then you go to them and say to them, you are wrong. Of course, this is a good, positive attitude that should be encouraged. It is wrong for us not to encourage anybody who stands against the coup. Also, that we should immediately within one day establish a new constitution which separates between the church and the state. No, this is not us. We came to power. We want to gain power through representing the will of the people, and main issues like this cannot be solved simply because one faction has the upper hand for a certain period of time. It should be done unanimously, but through the will of the people as a whole. Professor Nimr is there, can tell you about, thank God he is there, you can ask him directly. Also, the gentleman who I can't remember his name. Yes, I recognize it. Sorry, I didn't see you. You are a bit far away. Abu Bakr has relations with the Islamists. You know, this kind of talk, this talk brings you problems. You're not learning from your previous mistakes. No, I'm talking about your thought, your way of thinking. The way the Islamists think is problematic. First of all, to depict that the army should only belong to the Islamist movement, and also, for example, accusing everybody else not to be patriotic enough with the party. This is the bogeyman you use to frighten people away and drive a wedge in the populist movement. We come to liberate the army from the hands of the Islamists, because for 30 years the Islamists controlled the army as if it is the armed wing of their movement. The Islamist movement, which organized compulsory training camps, it was like some sort of an organized polarization. When we were in the university, they came to us, they asked us to join these camps, and the Islamist movement used to come to us either threatening or luring us into the army. The army, of course, by its very nature is secular. It is not Islamist, but they were, for example, sometimes even the army used to use the Islamists to achieve their aims and objectives, and they used to, for example, used to chant La ilaha illallah, no deity but Allah. An army's chants, because they wanted to control the political activities in the army. Amongst there are army officers who stood against the Islamist expansion in the army. So therefore, the Islamists the Islamist movement is the last party which should talk about defending the army because they destroyed the army. You're talking about the rapid intervention. We did not form that. Al-Bashir formed that to be a parallel organization to the army, and he created the Popular Defense and many other organizations. And the biggest army outside the army is the Islamist movement. So therefore, don't start falsely claiming that the others are against the army. We are with the army, and this was part of the projects they started and the demonstrations they organized, using the tactics of showing that they support the army, and some civil organizations supported them. Of course, some political organizations supported them. It's highly dangerous that there should be a relationship based on animosity between the civilians and the military. The win-win situation is there and is based on redefining the role of each party. Establishing the democratic and civil state is not in the interest of the civilians only. The military too should realize what they would benefit from that, because the kind of despotic regimes harm the army itself. I think the army and the military should be rebuilt on professional basis to be a national patriotic force defending the country, not through controlling power, but through fulfilling the duties assigned to them. So therefore, the military should be rebuilt, but only under a democratic regime, not a military rule situation. And also, there should be the question of justice. People should face this clearly. The military establishment has committed unspeakable crimes. They started the civil conflict in the south of Sudan. They followed a policy of a scorched earth policy. Massacres were committed in the south of Sudan, Darfur, mass murders, and before the rapid intervention, the rapid intervention was established in 2013. The massacres in Darfur were committed in 2003. So therefore, as for the question of let bygones be bygones, does not open the door for transitional justice. There should be a process whereby all the crimes are investigated and all the victims are compensated. As I said this clearly, some people think that in Sudan all blood is equal. No, there is some blood which is more equal than others. Some blood, if you spill a drop of, you'll end up with a crisis, and there is blood if you massively commit massacres and spill it. Nobody would raise a voice. But in the south, in the north, in the middle, everywhere crimes are committed. They should be all treated on equal footing, and transitional justice should be established so that everybody should be held accountable, and this is the way to recovery. It is in the interest of the military organization that the crimes committed in its name, they should admit to, so that a new, healthier relationship with the civilian side of society can be established. It has happened elsewhere in the world that the military, in Japan, for example, in Japan, in the days of the emperor, many crimes were committed. The entire army was destroyed. The Japanese did not want an army again. When they re-established the army, it belonged to the lowest rank in the community. In Argentina, the same thing happened. The military entered into conflicts with the people. Also, they lost the Falklands War, and they lost their social standing. Now, the military coup authority in the Sudan is leading the people, leading the army into confrontation with the people. The win-win situation can be established on the new basis of opening a new page based on a civil and democratic government. The army is unified under one flag on professional basis, carrying out its duties to defend the country without any involvement in politics, without being utilized in any political struggles. There is also a question about the military admitting that they do not want to cling to power. I think what they did is they are rethinking their position, and rather than be confused about what they mean and what they don't mean, I think it's better for us to go forward and occupy the space and not allow them to reoccupy the ground they lost, and change can be effected. But if they withdraw like 2 steps backwards tactically, with you being completely paralyzed and not being able to do anything, not being able to move forward, eventually they will regain the ground they lost and reestablish their authority. We think what they're doing is just a maneuver to divide the civilian forces, but we should also think about how we can benefit from that. Going back to what Shawki said. Shawki, I'm not with rapid intervention or anybody. What I'm saying is rapid intervention in its current formation is a huge problem because it's a parallel army. Anything that it can be disbanded by a political decision is nonsense. Sometimes speaking, frankly, people do not like. You cannot get rid of them except one of 2 means, either through war or negotiations. If you wage war against them, there is a wide possibility that this war will lead to the collapse of the country, because it will not be a war between the rapid intervention force and the national army. It will be a fight between members of a community. Of course, there has always been tribal conflict in the history of Sudan. But I think the military, they did not cause that, but they deepened the crisis. For example, in the Blue Nile, this was the first time the Hausa and Parda tribes had an armed confrontation. So this happened after the coup. So if people think we can disband the rapid intervention through war, if we discuss this possibility, if we wage war against them and defeat them, and the country does not collapse, this will not happen. By that I mean the military will not give up power after that. So winning against the rapid intervention can only, and winning it can only lead to one of two possibilities. Either the country collapsing or the military after winning consolidating its grip on power. Any negotiations, on the other hand, which leads to maintaining the status quo is not acceptable. But negotiations is judged and measured by its achievements, its aims and objectives. If there is a clear roadmap to achieve one national unified army through clear guarantees, this is what people, not the kind of negotiations that can create loose agreements which can allow for the signatories to renege on their promises. So therefore, transition should lead to unifying the armed forces and first of all to consolidate and tilt power in favor of the civilians, and they impose the agenda of a unified army, but only through negotiations between civilians and the armies on the role of the military, the powers, and how they should do that only. This will be a clear roadmap, Mr. Awatif. We cannot hear the lady because she's not using a microphone. Ultimately, Ms. Awatif, one of the failures of the transitional period that we did not treat the question of military and security reform. They should have had other priorities like establishing a unified professional army, because without a unified and professional army, the country would collapse. I think we have gone beyond the time allocated, and we wanted to allow more time for everybody to express their opinions freely without any time constraints. I prepared 5-6 pages of questions, but I will not ask them. I thank you, first of all, and I thank those who endured standing up for 2 hours. This does not happen often, and I think any event we want to organize in the future, we should add the word Sudan to it to attract audience. Anything we say about Fatah and Hamas in Palestine, we add the word Sudan. I think I promise you that next time any event we make, we will include the name of Sudan because of this huge interest you have shown. We hope that it was a success, but first of all, we should not forget to thank Mr. Khalid and Mr. Ammar, who helped us to organize the event, and I thank you. And we thank the interpreters. God help them with the speed with which Mr. Khalid was speaking. I wish I had listened to them to see what was happening. I thank my colleagues Samiha, Mu'mina, Wadi', Nagam, Mu'taz, all of them. and we look forward to meeting you in the future, and hopefully we will focus more on the Sudan. Thank you and God bless.